if I sound like a broken record while looking at clouds and talking into a camera, I apologize. But for those of you who don't know, those are real clouds. And when I was younger, in the 80s, I was born in 81. So when I was younger in the 80s, this is the type of clouds that we saw normally. If they cluster together, they would get fluffier and fluffier. And at some point during the early 2000s, while in Canada, I started to notice a lot of persistent contrails. Prior to persistent contrails, we saw contrails at the back of jets that would dissipate, like when you breathe your warm breath on an ice rink or in a cold environment. It trails behind you a little bit for a few seconds and then evaporates. And that's what we would see with jets. But then something changed in the early 2000s, and not just me, but a lot of people started to notice these, what they called persistent contrails or chemtrails. So most people have an issue with the word chemtrails, who are what I would call ultranormy 5000s. The ultranormy 5000s have an issue with the word chemtrails because they tie it into various red herring conspiracy theories that they have believed mainstream media and their version of what chemtrails are to be true. So if you believe a red herring as told to you by a mainstream media news outlet or a big tech conglomerate search engine, then you may never understand what chemtrails are. Just like if you look up sanitized versions of what happened to the USS Liberty or what happened on 9/11, you might never get the actual truth and only sanitized mainstream ready for mainstream consumption type news. So I know that this may come as a shocker to those of you who have been listening to me ramble into a camera, but Santa Claus is not real. And I hate to break it to you, but although he is talked about all around the world, and you may be convinced because he's on the side of Coca-Cola cans during the season, and so many people talk about him, you might be convinced that Santa Claus is real. It's just not the case. Now, your belief in him makes him an egregore that continually needs to be maintained and magnified and fed. And so you'll notice that every year, more and more people around the world are getting into Christmas. Nevertheless, all predicated upon a lie and a marketing scheme, which sucks because you have to lie to your children about it every year. And what does this have to do with chemtrails? Well, let me tell you. Right now, if you believe that all planes everywhere leave persistent contrails, or what we're calling chemtrails, then you have to go with the approach that for this entire video, there has been no planes in the sky because we don't see any persistent contrails or chemtrails. Now, if you look up like different types of planes, there are propeller planes, there are jets, all different types of planes, right? So old school propeller jets, when their engines are on, if they're running dirty with those propeller planes, prop engines, they might leave some white smoke depending on how dirty their mix is, right? Usually jets, like if you've taken a flight or been at an airport, you'll know normally it's not normal that like when you're at an airport that you see a bunch of exhaust fumes behind jets as they're taking off, or like your standard Airbus or your standard civilian flights. It's not normal to see a bunch of contrails as you're taking off, unless you're in like super, super cold temperatures. So I'll look up the flight radar for this area, and maybe I'll put it on the other side of this video, and you can see that right now there are planes in the sky. So the question would be, well, why aren't they leaving persistent contrails? So normally, if you look up in the sky over North America or over most European developed countries, you'll see chemtrails, what we're calling chemtrails. And if you have a issue with the word chemtrails, it is literally just an abbreviation for chemical trails. And if you were to dissect and analyze what the composition of the persistent contrails are, you would notice, oh, there are chemicals in these trails. Sometimes they might be aluminum, barium, strontium, depending on what they're spraying. And even if it was just jet engine exhaust, you might have some chemicals in it. But when we switch the topic into cloud seeding, they spray silver iodide or chaff to induce more, to fluffing up the clouds, make them bigger, right? They can create clouds, create bigger clouds, and if there is metal particulate in the clouds, or graphene, or any type of anything that would be electromagnetic or that you could apply electricity to, then you could combine what you're spraying with a ground-based microwave like NexRad or the HARP array, and instead of monitoring what's going on in the atmosphere, you could be actually sending direct radiation to it. Maybe not super noticeable to a lot of people, but you can microwave the clouds that you've created just enough to get them to move into a heat front, and you'll be suddenly directing clouds. And you'll notice it, that when the weatherman is telling you where the weather is, they notice low fronts and cold fronts, or low fronts and warm fronts, or hot and cold fronts of air moving around. And this is one of the things that drives weather patterns, is pockets of hot air and pockets of cool air. It's not an exact science. Lisbon has flooded in Portugal. Dubai has famously flooded recently. Saudi Arabia has flooded famously recently. And all these places are using cloud seeding programs, which is public information. Morocco in North Africa has been using cloud seeding programs recently, since the 80s actually. So it's a really long time to be doing cloud seeding. Ben Livingston was called the father of weather weapons. They were using weather weapons in Vietnam. They sprayed DDT years and years ago, before I was born. And right now in California, through the Palisades and the West Coast, they have bombers spraying all kinds of different things and fire retardants. Pop quiz. If you spray for 20 years aluminum or types of graphene or chaff into the sky, and it eventually falls down into the soil, contaminating the soil and then growing into the trees as the trees suck up the water from the soil, if you are to microwave or direct energy weapon the trees themselves, will they become tinder or easy to burn? If you contaminate all the soil and all the wildlife and flora and fauna and oceans with chemtrails, does that cause an acidification where eventually biology or biological life forms will struggle to actually survive? In this future where we're constantly chemtrailing and constantly geoengineering to solve the climate change crisis, which will be man-made by all this geoengineering, and then that will be the supposed answer for the problem that was created also by humans. You have geoengineering causing the problem, and then geoengineering will be the solution to the problem. Eventually, people will cry out, as they already do, for cloud seeding operations because they have no rain. Problem is, what goes up must come down. And so I don't even disagree with those crazy Saudis wanting it to rain in Mecca. I don't disagree with that. If you were living in Mecca and it had never rained, you might get to the point where you're like, I'm a trillionaire, I'm a billionaire, we're sitting on all this oil. Let's use some of this oil money and make it rain. Is that necessarily wrong? It's debatable, right? This is the conversation that we're having. And I know that you might think I'm crazy, and that's completely fine. I've been observing chemtrails in the sky since 2006, 2007. And here we are all these years later, almost 20 years. And now the ultra-normie 5000s are starting to admit, and the mainstream media is starting to admit, that geoengineering and cloud seeding does in fact exist. Of course, I've known this for 20 years, but it takes you guys a while to catch up. So these are real clouds, and I love seeing real clouds. That's why I'm filming them, and it makes me happy, and I wish that every day was like today. And there are planes in the sky today, and they're not leaving chemtrails for some reason right now. And you could say, well, it's because the weather patterns are not suitable. Maybe there's too much wind. Maybe nobody's paid for the cloud seeding operations, or depending on where you are, maybe just conditions aren't favorable. But I don't think today, January the 14th, has been the end of the chemtrail operations worldwide or the end of cloud seeding. I think as long as we're alive, humanity is going to have this issue of, like, people want it to rain, and people want cloud cover. People want to block the sun for some reason. Maybe the sun is too bright. Maybe there are patents on the sun for the sun simulator, and maybe people don't want you to know that there's a sun simulator. So, endless conspiracy theories about the sun simulator, but you can look up the patents. It's just a question of, is what you're seeing in the sky the sun simulator, or is it the real sun? My biggest concern as a farmer is not about the sun simulator, although some people have been complaining that their crops are getting burned faster. My biggest concern about the whole geoengineering thing is what they're spraying in the sky, coming down into the soil, contaminating the soil and contaminating the water and growing through the plants and the trees. And then the trees are basically sitting duck targets for microwave weapons or direct energy weapons, or they're susceptible to microwaves, similar to how if you put aluminum foil in a microwave, you'll see sparks, right? Similarly, you don't want to contaminate your body with heavy metals and live in a condo where there are Wi-Fi routers all around you, because you'll get sick. Similar to how you want to get the amalgam fillings out of your face because we're surrounded by microwaves, and you don't want the inside of your brain or the inside of your nervous system to be looking like the inside of a microwave when you drop metal in it and turn it on. So I love seeing real clouds. So if we were to cloud seed over top of these clouds right now, say at 38,000 feet, if we were to drop some silver iodide on these, then those clouds would get bigger, depending on which way they're going in the jet stream and the weather, whichever wind pattern they're going. But then eventually when the clouds burst, they're so heavy that the moisture in it has to drop. Now you have a mixture of whatever chemicals that you sprayed and rain which would be like distilled water, 0 parts per million total dissolved solids water, but then whatever solids that you put into it, like silver iodide or metal or graphene or whatever, falls to the ground, right? It falls to the ground, and then you have the sun come out the next day or the same day, depending on what time of day this happens. And then you have the sun or the arc reactor in the sky basically drawing out everything again. So it creates more clouds. And then those clouds sometimes get sprayed again with more geoengineering. So it's a cycle, right? This is the cycle of water distillation in its purest form. And I'm glad that we stayed to the end here. You have a real cloud, and then you have a real jet leaving a real contrail, which is disappearing behind it. Now, at any moment, depending on how it works with various geoengineering and chemtrail programs, this pilot may or may not be unaware that he has an on-off switch for whatever chemical composition that they're doing. But what we'll do is we'll look up that flight, and it looks like a contrail to me, and we'll look up that flight and we'll see, what is exactly going on and where is he coming from and where is he going. But so to me, that is a contrail. But even contrails, they could be spraying something. You never know. And even if it's just a contrail, do you really want jet engine exhaust all through your skies? But I'm happy to see something like that. And if that was all we saw every day, that would be fantastic. But the persistent contrails or lines in the sky obviously block out the sun. If you're doing solar farming or recapturing or capturing the sun for solar panels, then it's really destroying your livelihood. And if you're relying on it for electricity, then it's really impeding your electrical inputs for the day on your solar panels by more than half when you block out the sun with chemtrails. So the future, if we're just going to allow and continue to allow worldwide geoengineering, is going to look a little bit bleak for those trying to get independent or get off the grid. If you're relying on solar, I would say if you have an area that has a lot of wind, maybe get some smaller, not the large ones, but maybe like the 4-foot wind turbines so that you're not just relying on solar. Yeah. So I'm happy to see real clouds, and I hope that you are too. This is what they used to look like back in the 80s. There are some places in the world that don't allow geoengineering or cloud seeding programs. I would suggest that you look up where those places are and then maybe think about relocating there if you're concerned about geoengineering. I have faith in humanity that one day the geoengineering will stop and people will realize it's not a great idea. Although, again, I'm not even saying the Saudis are wrong to want to make it rain over Mecca. It's just, again, it's not an exact science. So when it floods, who is to blame? The wealthier than snot Saudis want to blame somebody. So I'm sure there's lawsuits and insurance claims and lots of supercars ruined and property ruined. And this is just the reality of, playing Allah or playing God. So I can still see that plane and the contrail that it's leaving. If every day was like this, I'd be happy. But as we all know, most days don't look like this. Just give me some real weather, you know what I mean? Feeling a little under the weather. Well, humans can create weather now, and we have been for a long time. And I'm sorry that you live in the fairy tale world, but in the real world, cloud seeding is a real thing, and you can look it up. And chemtrail operations and God knows what they're spraying could be done under the guise of cloud seeding, and you would never be the wiser because you have to be able to actually test what they're spraying. So you can assume the best, which is nice of you, but the blind spot of good people is taken advantage of.